This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to the July edition of 1 Month to a Better Compliance program. This month, we're going to focus on 1 month to better internal controls. This month's sponsor is Workiva, and first I'd like to have a word from our sponsor.
Thanks, Tom. Workiva delivers a modern internal control solution that connects risk and internal control information across the enterprise. The Wdesk Cloud Platform is collaborative, powerful, and intuitive, and optimizes documentation, testing, approval, and reporting processes. The platform is proven to increase productivity and drive better decision-making and is used by more than 2,800 organizations worldwide for financial reporting and ICFR processes. To learn more, visit www.workiva.com.
Over the next month, I'm going to explore several topics related to internal controls. We're going to take a look at what internal controls are and how they relate to a best practices compliance program. I'm going to help you understand how to design an internal controls regime for compliance, and then some of the specific internal controls for the functional disciplines within a corporate compliance program. We're going to take a look at the COSO 2013 framework around internal controls and explain how that integrates into your best practices compliance program. I think it'll be a fascinating month for you. We'll certainly explore the area of internal controls in depth. This podcast, 1 Month to a Better Compliance program, is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Day 9, Mapping Your Internal Compliance Controls. As the Securities and Exchange Commission made clear with several FCPA enforcement actions in 2016, the agency has placed, or the Commission rather, has placed a renewed interest in the accounting provisions of the FCPA, specifically the internal controls provisions. The BHP enforcement action continued this trend, where there was no evidence that bribes were paid or offered in violation of the FCPA, yet the poor internal compliance controls at BHP led to a $25 million fine. Kara Brockmeyer, the former chief FCPA Unit Division of Enforcement of the SEC, reiterated that the SEC was committed to protecting investors in U.S. public companies and those which list other securities in the U.S. through enforcement of the accounting provisions, including internal control provisions. It would seem the reason is straightforward. A company with rigorous internal controls is better able to prevent, detect, and remedy any FCPA violations which may occur, or better yet, prevent them from actually occurring. What can you do around the FCPA's requirement for internal controls and the current SEC emphasis on enforcing the FCPA's requirement for good internal controls? I would suggest you begin with an exercise where you map the internal controls your company has in place to the indicia of the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program as set out by the FCPA guidance. While most compliance practitioners are familiar with the 10 hallmarks, you may not be as familiar with the standards for internal controls. I would suggest that you begin with the COSO 2013 Internal Control Framework, which we're going to discuss in several podcasts down the road. As a lawyer or compliance practitioner, you may not be familiar with all the internal controls that you have in place. This exercise would give you a good opportunity to meet with the heads of internal audit, finance and accounting, treasury, or other functions in your company that deal with financial internal controls. Talk with them about the financial controls you may already have in place. An easy example is employee expense reports. Every company I've ever worked for or even heard about requires expenses for reimbursements to be presented in a documented form on some type of expense reimbursement form. This is mandatory for IRS reporting, so all entities perform this action. How many controls are there in place? Is it the employee who submits the expense reimbursement? And is that employee required to sign it? Does the employee's immediate supervisor review, approve, and sign it? Does any party in the employee's direct reporting chain review, approve, and sign? Does anyone from accounts payable review, approve, both for accuracy and to make sure all referenced expenses are properly receipted? Is there any other review in accounts payable? Is there any aggregate review of expense reports? Is there any monetary limit over the additional reviews and approvals which occur? Now, if the employee has submitted expenses for activities that occurred outside the U.S., are there any foreign government officials involved? Were those employees identified on their expense report? Was the purpose of the meal, gift, or other hospitality recorded? Can you aggregate the money spent on any one foreign official or by a single employee in your expense reporting system? All of these are internal controls that can be mapped in the appropriate prong of the 10 hallmarks or other indicia of your best practices compliance program. You can take this exercise to the end of each of the 5 objectives under the 2013 COSO Internal Controls Framework and its attendant 17 principles. From mapping them, you can come up with a gap analysis to determine where you might need to implement internal compliance controls into your anti-corruption compliance program. This can lead to remedial steps that you can take. For example, you can recommend procedures be written in for all key compliance areas in which there are currently no procedures, or existing procedures that can be updated to include compliance issues and clear definitions on how controls are to be evidenced. Through this, you can move to having to detect controls in place to having prevent controls in place whenever possible. As a Chief Compliance Officer or compliance practitioner, this is an exercise you can engage in at no cost. You simply investigate and note what internal controls you have in place and how they may be a part of your anti-corruption efforts going forward. As I previously noted, compliance is a straightforward exercise. This does not mean it was easy. This does that you do have to work at it, so it will not appear that you simply have a paper program or a check-the-box program. But using the excuse that you have limited resources is simply an excuse, and a rather poor one at that. While the clear lesson from the BHP enforcement action is that you are required to have effective internal controls in place, by engaging in this mapping exercise, you can then figure out what you have, and more importantly, what internal controls that you do not have and need to institute. We previously took a look at gap analysis, and all of those factors and criteria, of course, apply here. So what are the 3 key takeaways from today? Well, number 1, you've got to learn what internal controls your company has in place. It may turn out that you have many or most of the compliance internal controls that you need. You're just simply not calling them compliance internal controls. 2, I'd really suggest that you map your internal controls to the COSO 2013 Internal Controls Framework. This is really the best framework I have seen. It's something the government recognizes, the Securities and Exchange Commission recognizes, and I don't think you can go wrong if you map to that framework. And leading to number 3, you've got to use your gap analysis as a basis for remediation. You actually have to do something after you have made the mapping exercise and the internal controls. If you don't do anything, if you put your gap analysis and your roadmap in a desk, it will be of no use to you and certainly will be no help to you if the government comes knocking. Remember, the SEC has separate jurisdiction for U.S. public companies on internal controls, and they're required to have effective internal controls. This means the SEC can simply notify you that it wants to review your internal compliance controls, and you will have to have evidence that you have them in place and that they are effective. This is Tom Fox. I hope you've enjoyed Day 9 to 1 month to a more effective internal controls, and I hope you'll join me tomorrow for Day 10. This is Tom Fox again. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of 1 month to better internal controls. If you've listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate this podcast, as it would help in our rankings. Get the word out about the only 1 month podcast series, which enables you to design, implement, and enhance a better compliance program. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you will join us again tomorrow.